In many years of teaching Italian, I've noticed that Italian learners often make similar mistakes. So here I've compiled a list of the top 10 mistakes Italian learners make, plus some tips on how to avoid them. I'm Valentina Stella, native Italian teacher, and as of today, I've taught more than 5,600 individual classes, plus about 600 group classes. And my real life experience as a teacher is what inspires my videos, and today's one came from noticing how most students of any level actually struggle with these precise topics, and I want to help you with this. You can also use this compilation as a checklist to assess how you're doing and where you need more practice. Also, remember that for most of the topics we're going to touch on today, you can find some of my other videos where I dive deeper into each one of them. So if you are confused about any of these topics, you can refer to those videos, and I'm going to link them in the description below this video as always. So, let's begin. Iniziamo. Errore numero 1. Skipping the definite article. Now, when we talk about definite article, we're talking about the in English, and in Italian we have multiple ways of saying that. But the number one mistake is skipping the definite article altogether in Italian. Why does that happen? Because in some other languages, especially in English, you may not use the definite article as much as we do. The classical example sentence I always give to clarify this point is this. If you want to say, I eat pizza in Italian, in English you say, I eat pizza. So no article for this. But in Italian, if you want to say that correctly, you need to use the definite article. So you need to say, mangio la pizza. I know in English you don't use the article in this instance, but in Italian you need to. So how can you avoid this mistake of skipping the definite article? Well, you just need to develop the habit of including the definite article in your sentence, even if it doesn't sound that right from your language perspective, from English perspective, for example. Most likely you will need the article for the Italian sentence. So just get into the habit of including the definite article in your sentence. Mistake number 2, misuse of definite articles. So as we just said, many students forget to use the definite article in Italian, but something else that's very common, is picking the wrong one. Now, Italian definite articles can be very tricky. Why? Well, in English, you have one, the, and it works with everything. But in Italian, we have 7 ways of translating the. Il, lo, la, etc. Those are the definite articles. So picking the right one can be very difficult. How do you pick the right one? It depends on the gender and number of the noun. So the type of mistake I always see is a mistake like this. Let's suppose you want to say the house. House is casa, and many students say il casa. But this is wrong because casa is feminine, singular, and il is not singular article for sure, but it's the one that we use with masculine nouns, not feminine nouns. So they don't match. The correct one would be la casa. La casa would be the correct one. Why is la correct? Because la matches the noun, and matching the noun is key to use Italian correctly. The noun, as I always say, is the king or the queen of the sentence. If the noun is feminine, then you need to use everything that refers to the noun needs to be feminine. If the noun is masculine, anything that refers to the noun needs to be masculine. Another mistake that I commonly see is the same concept with plural nouns. So let's suppose you want to say the girls. The word for girls is ragazze, but some students may say I ragazze. This is wrong because ragazze is feminine plural, so you need the feminine plural article for that. Le ragazze. Le ragazze is the correct one. So always remember to match the article with the gender and number, singular or plural, of the noun. That's something that you need to remember. How can you do this? Well, how can you avoid this problem? Well, the first thing that you need to do is to learn and keep practicing gender and making the plural, gender of nouns and making the plural nouns in Italian until you get sick of it. I'm not kidding. This is the only way to go, and I know the gender of nouns is the very first thing that you learn when you learn Italian, and many students are like, oh yeah, I know that, I've learned that, I want to move on, I want to go to subjunctive, I want to learn subjunctive, and so they they go over this topic very quickly because they get bored. So you know what happens? That I get students who want to use subjunctive, but they still cannot use this correctly, and subjunctive can be tricky, it's difficult, but it's not essential to communicate effectively. Instead, this is. So never overlook the gender nouns. Really learn it and practice until you're sick of it, but you learn it. Also, articles can be tricky for another reason too. First of all, we have 7 of them. But we have 7 of them because they depend, the right one depends on the gender of the noun, on the number of the noun, if the number is singular or plural, but also what the noun begins with, what letter the noun begins with. So this can really take you into a very confusing state. You need to learn all the rules of the articles, memorize them, and remember them. If you want, I have a dedicated online class on definite articles that you can watch. I'm going to leave the link in the description below, and I go over all the definite articles with a lot of examples, and I clarify the rules and share a few tricks to remember them. Errore numero 3. Mistake number 3. Incorrect verb conjugation. Now, this is something that makes many students struggle, and that's normal because Italian conjugation is something that's very difficult and confusing, especially because it's something that you may not have in your language. So remember to change the ending of a verb depending on the subject and depending on the tense. This is what conjugating a verb is, can be very overwhelming. So what I often see is something like this. Let's suppose someone wants to say I eat. They may remember that. So they may say io mangio, and that's correct. But let's suppose they want to move on to another subject, and for example, they want to say they eat. It's not that uncommon, unfortunately, to see loro, non oro, loro, which means they, mangio. This can never be right in Italian because mangio is the specific ending for io, and loro will have a different ending. So this is what happens with incorrect verb conjugation. The correct one for loro would be mangiano. So it's the specific ending for loro. This can create a lot of trouble in real life, so it's not just a grammar rule, because in Italian we often drop the subject pronoun. So instead of saying io mangio, we may just say mangio. We can do that because in Italian the ending o is for the first person. So I know by hearing mangio you're saying I eat, just by seeing mangio. I don't need to state the subject pronoun. But if you do that and you pick the wrong ending for the subject that you mean to say, like with loro, if you remove loro and you say mangio, I understand you're talking about yourself. I can never imagine you're talking about them because you're not stating the subject and you're using the wrong ending. So this is why correct verb conjugation is crucial for speaking Italian correctly. So how do you avoid this? Well, you need to practice different conjugations regularly and repeating them aloud. So I always tell students the only way to memorize verbs is this, that you repeat them a lot, and I recommend aloud, going from io to loro for all the verbs that you learn and different tenses. And you really need to do this a lot. Believe it or not, that's how we learn Italian conjugations as kids. This is something many students don't realize. Italian can be hard and is hard for native Italian speakers. As kids, we spend a lot of time learning our grammar. I still remember when I was 8 years old, repeating all my conjugations aloud in front of the class because the teacher called me at the desk, and I had to recite all the conjugations or the endings for the different tenses in front of my class. That's how we learn. There's no magic pill or practice. Repetition is key even for us. So if we did this, why shouldn't you? Please do this. It's going to help. It's going to work. Just repeat your conjugations aloud, because when you say that aloud, it works better with your brain and you will finally learn them. But it takes a lot of repetition. So ripeti, ripeti, ripeti. Also, I made a lot of videos where I conjugate a verb, especially for irregular verbs that can be even more tricky. So I conjugate a verb, repeating it aloud the way I want you to practice, and I go through different tenses. So if you want, you can watch those videos and repeat aloud after me. You don't need to do this by yourself. You can do that with me. I'm going to leave you the link in the description. Mistake number 4, confusion of prepositions. Now, prepositions are the bane of existence of many Italian learners, and understandably so. Prepositions in Italian are very difficult and can be very confusing. And the reason is that we do use prepositions more often than in English, and we use them differently. So something I always see and hear is something like this. Let's suppose a student wants to say, I am in Rome. They most of the times will say, sono in Roma. Or let's suppose they want to say, I'm in school. They say, sono in scuola. But these are wrong, because in this instance, I know that your brain wants to go to the easy way of using the same preposition. We have in English and we have in Italian, so why don't we use the same? Unfortunately, that's not possible, because in this instance, we don't use in. In English, you use in, but in Italian, we actually use a. So the correct way of saying I'm in Rome is actually sono a Roma. The correct way of saying I am in school is sono a scuola. And you need to learn that. So how can you avoid this? Prepositions can be overwhelming, especially if you keep trying to compare them to the English one. You can't. Don't try to memorize, this preposition means all these different things in English. You're going to be overwhelmed. So what I recommend to all my students is you don't try to learn all of them at once. My trick is break them down into groups by function. What do I mean with that? You can learn the way we use prepositions for talking about places. You can talk about how we use preposition for talking about time. You can learn how to use prepositions specific for a verb. Remember, in Italian, the number of prepositions is limited. We have a certain amount of prepositions. What's tricky is that they will change meaning from an English perspective, depending if you're using them to talk about a place, or if you're using them to talk about time, or if they go with a specific verb. So don't try to memorize all the different meanings for one preposition. Just put that in context and learn how we use, for example, the preposition a when talking about place. And then when you've mastered that, go to how to use the preposition a to talk about time. That's my trick for learning prepositions in a doable way. Mistake number 5, misplacing adjectives. Now, in Italian, adjectives generally go after the noun, which is the opposite as in English. So, for example, if you want to say an interesting book, in Italian, the correct way of saying that is un libro interessante. Un libro interessante is the correct way. We don't say un interessante libro, an interesting book. We say a book interesting. And as weird as that may sound, I know that's how we say that. So the usual general way of placing the adjective correctly is after the noun. Now, this is not a hard rule, so sometimes we may place the adjective before the noun, but that's usually done to add emphasis when we're using adjectives that describe a noun. So in general, the adjectives that describe a noun, like for example, if the book is interesting, if the book is big, if the book is small, is short, those adjectives go after the noun in Italian. Also, make sure to learn the different types of adjectives. So, for example, possessive adjectives, how to use them correctly. Adjectives like bello and buono, which don't follow this rule, make sure to learn about them correctly. And in general, if you are not clear about what an adjective is, what a noun is, I know this terminology can be confusing for so many students because it's something that we learn as kids. And by the way, not all schools in all countries devote to this the same amount of time because you may not need too much stress on this terminology. In Italian, you need, I told you, we work a lot regarding to learn Italian grammar correctly. So if you're confused on what an adjective actually is and how to place it, I'm going to leave in the description some videos, a link to some videos that I made to clarify this terminology. So what an adjective is, what a noun is, what an article is, what a verb is. I'm going to leave you the link in the description below. You can watch those videos and I talk about these topics more in depth. I also have some dedicated video on different types of adjectives and how to use them correctly. Again, the link is going to be in the description. Mistake number 6. Errore numero 6. Forgetting the double consonants. So now this mistake has to do more with spelling and pronunciation than grammar, but it's still very, very important. Italian words often contain double consonants, and missing one consonant, first of all, changes the meaning of the word, and second, may create a little bit of misunderstanding with the other person, which can be more fun or less fun depending on the word you're talking about. So let me give an example. If we have the word pala, that in Italian means shovel. Instead, if the same word, if you double it up, double the L up, that means ball. So palla and palla. So maybe you want to talk about a ball, but you end up talking about a shovel. So that can be very confusing. So how can you avoid this? You need to always make sure that you learn the spelling of a word correctly and pay extra attention if the word has any double consonants. Memorize them because they are crucial. And also you need to practice the pronunciation of the double consonants. You need to emphasize them more. You need to keep the sound for longer when you pronounce a double consonant. So listen to the difference. The first one is pala, more relaxed. The second one is palla. I emphasize it more and I keep the L sound for longer. That's how I make a double consonant. And you need to practice this. So when you memorize a new word, make sure to memorize the correct spelling and practice that word aloud a lot. Errore numero 7. Mistake number 7. Mixing up essere, avere, and stare. Oh, this can create a lot of confusion. Why does that happen? Why the verbs essere, avere, and stare are so often confused by students? The reason, as always, is the English perspective. So from an English perspective, these verbs may need, all of them, in some cases, may mean to be. So there are some instances where in English you just use the verb to be, but in Italian, it will depend. It could be essere, it could be avere, and it could be stare. And so that's why they're often mixed up. So let me give you an example. We use the verb stare to translate to be in English when we talk about health in general. Like when you ask, how are you? How do you ask how are you in Italian? Come stai? We use the verb stare, not the verb essere, even though this is to be in English. Or if you want to say, like she is 30 years old. In English you say she is, so use the verb to be, but in Italian you need to use avere for that. So it would be lei ha 30 anni o 30 anni. Lei ha 30 anni. I know from an English perspective that's to be, but in Italian we need to use avere, so that's why it's confusing. You keep changing them. So a very common mistake is to say lei è 30 anni, but that's wrong because we always use the verb avere for talking about age. We always use the verb stare to talk about health in general. So how do you avoid this confusion? Well, you just need to practice them a lot. They are often overlooked again because they are beginner verbs, because they are auxiliary verbs. But again, you need to literally hammer those in your brain. And that you do that just with repetition. Stare versus essere can be especially confusing. I do have a dedicated video that clarifies how to pick the right one depending on what you're saying. So I'm going to leave the description in the link in the description below. Errore numero 8. Incorrect use of tu and lei. In Italian, there's a difference between the informal you, which is tu, and the formal you, which is lei. Yes, exactly as she. The same subject pronoun for she is the same we use for the formal you, which is lei. So what happens if you don't use this correctly? Well, you may sound rude. So for example, let's suppose you're at a table and you're asking someone you don't have much confidence with to if they can please pass you the salt. If you say, puoi passarmi il sale? Can you pass me the salt? This uses the formal you, the tu. And that might sound too familiar if that's someone you have never had a relationship with before, like you didn't know them before. So the correct way of saying this to someone who's a stranger, or if you're in a very formal context, would be può passarmi il sale? So I'm not using tu for this, I'm using the conjugation for lei. Può passarmi il sale? So how do you avoid this? Get in the habit when you are in a formal context, when you are with someone who is a stranger, who you have never met before, or you're simply in a formal context. Maybe it's your doctor in Italy, but it's still formal because he's not a friend or she's not a friend of yours. They are a doctor, so it's a very formal relationship. Get into the habit of using lei with them. Do not use tu. As I always tell students, there's no police for this, so if you don't use this correctly, police is not going to get you. But this is something that's part of our culture, and it's a way of showing respect to a person you have never met before, a person who's a stranger, or a person who has a very formal relationship with you. We use the lei to show that respect. Okay, we're almost done. How are you doing with those? I hope these are clarifying a few points. So let's see errore numero 9, mistake number 9. And that's to forget using reflexive verbs. Reflexive verbs are something that's typical of the Italian language that you don't really have, for example, in English. You do have them in other languages like Spanish, for example. But they are crucial in Italian because that's how we do use them to talk about actions that reflect on the self. So that's why they are called reflexive verbs. Whenever you have a verb, an action, if you direct that action away from yourself, then you use a regular verb. But if the direction of that action is inward toward yourself, it's like the action reflects from you back to yourself. In those instances, you will need to use reflexive verbs. So, for example, a common mistake I see is that students say io sveglio alle 7. That means they think they're saying I wake up at 7. But in reality, to complete that sentence, to make the sentence correctly in Italian, you will need something here. Io mi sveglio. That mi is called a reflexive pronoun, and it's needed to clarify that the action of waking up is reflecting back to yourself. So I am waking up myself. That's what it means. I wake myself up. That's how we say that. And a lot of verbs are used in the reflexive form in Italian. So the way you avoid these is that you, first of all, need to learn the most common reflexive verbs. So which verbs are used in a reflexive way? For example, svegliarsi, alzarsi, prepararsi. So to wake up, to get ready, those are all reflexive verbs, are used in the reflexive form in Italian. That's the first thing you need to do to avoid these. Learn the most common reflexive verbs and then learn how to conjugate them correctly, because this tiny word, the reflexive pronoun, pronouns are so tricky. And so you need to learn how to take care of the verb but still keeping in mind that you need to take care of this pronoun too. Fear not, I have 2 dedicated videos on this topic. The first video is with the most common reflexive verbs, that's good to know. And the second is how to conjugate reflexive verbs. So if you want to work more on this, please, you know that by now, have a look at the description box below this video. And finally, errore numero 10, mistake number 10, mispronouncing vowels. Now, this is a pronunciation mistake, but as I always say, pronunciation is key, is crucial in Italian as much as grammar. You need good grammar, but you also need good pronunciation, because mispronouncing words can lead to a lot of misunderstanding. Now, everyone worries about the R. When they learn Italian, they're like, oh, I cannot roll my R. How can I do without that? How am I going to be able to speak Italian without rolling my R's? I'm going to tell you something I tell all my students. Rolling the R's is not so important. Believe me, there are many Italians who cannot roll, we don't really roll, but let's call that that way. Many Italians who cannot roll their R's. And guess what? We can still understand them perfectly without any problem, and they're still Italian. So rolling the R is something good to be able to do, but on the other hand, vowels pronunciation is much more crucial for avoiding misunderstandings. If you mispronounce the R, like you don't roll that properly, I still can understand you perfectly. But if you mispronounce a vowel, you may end up saying something different, especially because in Italian we use a lot of vowels. Every word ends in a vowel, and the ending vowel determines the gender and the number of the word. So it determines the meaning of the actual word. So if you, for example, that's something very similar. If you want to say girls, and this is how you spell it. But if you do one of the most common mistakes I've seen, which is pronouncing the ending E, the English way, with an E sound. So if you pronounce these as ragazzi, in Italian, you're not saying that word, you're saying this word. So if you say ragazzi, in Italian, you're saying the second word. And that doesn't mean girls, that means boys. So by mispronouncing one vowel, you're changing the meaning of the word. And this can lead to a lot of problems and misunderstandings. So this is one common mistake, mispronouncing vowels, and the other common mistake is skipping vowels. Like, for example, in this word, this is a perfect example, because what happens is many people mispronounce the O by turning it into a new sound, and they skip completely the ending E. But that never happens in Italian. We never skip our vowels or our letters. So what I've heard a lot is mozzarella. Mozzarella is not Italian. Maybe similar to some regional dialects, but it's definitely not standard Italian. Correct standard Italian pronunciation for that is mozzarella. Mozzarella. I'm pronouncing every vowel and I'm pronouncing it correctly with the right sound, Italian sound. So how do we avoid that? Well, you learn correct Italian vowel pronunciation and take your time to really articulate every single vowel. I always tell my students, if you take your time to articulate every vowel, every letter correctly, you will not sound stupid, I promise. Many students think, oh, if I slow down and articulate every vowel correctly, people are going to think I'm dumb, I'm stupid. No, we're not. We're going to think that you're correct, that you can pronounce words correctly. If you skip your vowels or try to, say them very fast because you were like, oh, they're not going to notice, I'm going to say that very quickly, so they're not going to notice, I'm not sure how to pronounce this. You know what? We're going to notice. So it's better it's much better to slow down, articulate every single vowel correctly, and you're going to sound perfectly Italian. If you need help with pronunciation, I have a dedicated pronunciation playlist on my channel, so have a look at that. Ok ragazzi, guys, there you have it. Top 10 mistakes that Italian learners make and how to avoid them. I know this was a lot, but I hope I offered you a good, extensive checklist that you can use to assess how you're doing with your Italian and where you need to work more. And let me know which one of these is the hardest for you. I really want to know. So share that in a comment below the video, and if you like this video, give it a thumbs up, and if you haven't already, subscribe to my channel, click the bell and select all to receive all the notifications from all my new videos. That's all for today. Buona giornata e a presto. Ciao da Valentina.